In England, during the last 20 years of the 17th century, some of the grandest architectural gestures occur, the most famous of which is Chatsworth House, set stunningly against a small hillside in Derbyshire. Still owned and opened by the Dukes of Devonshire and their family, Chatsworth is, without doubt, one of England's greatest treasure houses. Perhaps it's closest to architect Inigo Jones' interpretation of classicism for the Queen's House at Greenwich, but on a much grander scale. It heralds the beginning of a new age in England, for that of increasingly interpreting the architectural elements of both ancient Greece and Rome, and its continuing themes of liberty, religion, and justice. The original Chatsworth House had been built after 1552 by Bess of Hardwicke and her second husband, the first Earl, Sir William Cavendish. In 1688, the fourth Earl and first Duke of Devonshire, another William Cavendish, 1640 to 1707, employed the quarrelsome character, the architect William Talman, 1650 to 1719. We know nothing of Talman's preparation as an architect, except that he was employed in the gradual rebuilding of the south front, which is today a majestic statement of an original kind. When it was completed, it surprised and delighted everyone with its Italianate balustrades to the roofline and restrained use of giant classical order. Using balustrades was a distinct change from a hipped roof, and they emphasised the horizontal emphasis of its mass. The facade has been likened to Bernini's designs for the Louvre, and it skillfully conceals the old Elizabethan building behind it. The Duke enjoyed himself constructing the new building so much that he enlarged his original intentions and works, continuing it until just before his death in 1707. The west and north fronts were added and are more than likely the work of the architect Thomas Archer, 1668 to 1743, whose work has been overshadowed by the more well-known efforts of some of his contemporaries. The majestic west front that he built is the one that looks down the valley and can be viewed across a classically formatted bridge that was added later. It is 9 bays wide, and its centrally disposed pediment is supported by 4 columns, with 4 pairs of flat columns, known as pilasters, flanking the other bays. Due to the slope of the site, the west front is taller than the south front. It's also very much livelier, with much carved stonework, and the sash window frames are highlighted by the application of gold leaf, which is a luxurious statement and a splendid sight when they catch the rays of the setting sun. At Chatsworth in recent years, there has been a great deal of cleaning, restoration, and some changes in the way the interiors are arranged, especially the 17th century state apartments where the monarch would have been accommodated on a royal visit. There are masterpieces in every room, and the collections now provide a visual narrative of the family over the time it has lived in this lovely valley. Everywhere you look, there is rare and beautiful treasures, laid out in a sequence of splendid rooms which are disposed along an enfilade, created for the first Duke as a backdrop for Baroque court ritual. After entering the house from a long dark corridor, the painted hall is quite confronting with its blaze of light and colour. It has had major alterations at least twice since the first Duke's day. Originally, twin staircases led up to the mezzanine level, which has remained more or less intact. Documentation reveals that in 1688, the Huguenot immigrant Jean Tijoux received £250 for the iron balustrade around the first level, which was finally fitted in 1691. The hall does retain its original black and white marbled floor and painted decoration by another Huguenot worker, Louis Laguerre, 1606 to 1656. His works depict scenes from the life of Julius Caesar, while an assembly of the gods looks down from the ceiling. The current single staircase was designed by W.H. Romaine Walker and installed early in the 20th century. In the interior of the recently restored State Drawing Room, completed between 1689 to 94, the timber for the wainscoting was brought from Hull, and the wood carvers Joel Lobb, Roger Davis and Samuel Watson rendered and applied ornaments in lime wood after the style of Grinling Gibbons. Samuel Watson's musical trophy contains a violin and was surely inspired by Grinling Gibbons' work at Petworth House. Carved ornaments surround the one portrait in the oval, which is appropriately the 4th Earl and the 1st Duke himself, William Cavendish. The Mortlake tapestries above the wainscoting were woven in 1630, and they depict the healing of the lame man at the gate of the temple. The painting in the great cove of the ceiling is by French Huguenot worker Louis Laguerre. It depicts in oil on plaster an assembly of the gods, and in the coving the stories are about the forge of Vulcan and Vulcan discovering the lovers Mars and Venus. It's interesting to note that Chatsworth has on display a Grinling Gibbons treasure of its own, a carved cravat, whose delicate detail of its lacework is quite breathtaking. The sterling silver chandelier is recorded as having arrived in a shipment of goods to Chatsworth in 1694. It hangs in the closet, a private, intimate space next to the bedchamber in which the monarch could work and relax when visiting. The state bed itself retains almost unbelievably the original silk damask, except for the material on the bed's headboard, which has been rewoven and recovered. The bedroom also contains part of the superb collection of blue and white ceramics at Chatsworth, advertising the fashionable taste of the latter years of the 17th century, when the rooms were created. Baluster flower vases, pyramids and urns are all true examples of Baroque exuberance, with the deft Delft painters rendering scenes with cobalt inspired by Eastern imports. Unable to produce true porcelain like that now arriving in droves from China until well into the 18th century, these tin-glazed earthenwares provided English and European states with a means of producing their own ceramics and also using local motifs from cultural sources as an expression of national pride. The pyramidal form of the tulip vases is symbolic of the hierarchy attached to contemporary society at the time. During the latter part of the 17th century, an increasing variety of textiles were coming into use for wall hangings and upholstery. However, nearly all big houses with any pretension to fashion still had one room hung with superbly rendered leather hangings that had been punched, painted and gilded gloriously. In the music room at Chatsworth, the recently restored leather hangings quite take your breath away, as do some of the house's best examples of furniture by Louis XIV's favourite furniture designer, André Charles Boulle, superbly inlaid with brass and tortoiseshell. As well, there are some quite wonderful paintings, including a personal favourite, the delightful Magdalena, one of the two daughters of the very talented Flemish painter Cornelis de Vos, 1584 to 1651. The music room contains a rare surviving harpsichord, while the most popular of its treasures is a most extraordinary example of a trompe-l'oeil, a painted violin hanging on the back of a door, which does indeed trick the eye. Commissioned from painter Jan van der Vaart, 1653 to 1727, for the family's house in town, Devonshire House at Piccadilly, as we gaze at a close-up, it is possible to imagine Canada's Aradia Ensemble playing a glorious confection composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully, one that combines a sense of the Italian commedia dell'arte with a joyous French air. It certainly would be appropriate to the setting. The violin is part of a legacy of style and influence that in the second half of the 17th century would transform the standard and practices of the orchestra. Hannah Obi, Curator of Decorative Art and Estate Collections at Chatsworth, in May 2008 said, "The integrity of approach, coupled with the desire to make the space easy for visitors to interpret, is characteristic of the duty of care felt by the current Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. Thus Chatsworth continues to evolve, the achievements of previous generations providing sure foundations on which the next can build." The fourth Earl and first Duke, William Cavendish of Chatsworth, was one of the leading promoters of the glorious English Revolution that brought the Dutch rulers William and Mary to the throne of England in 1688. It was quite a year. It was certainly a painful one for James II, who was swept off the throne within 3 years of his brother Charles II's death by none less than the husband of his daughter. William, sovereign prince of the House of Orange in the Dutch Republic, championed the Protestant faith. James II had wanted to restore the Catholic faith in England, but the People's Parliament would have none of it. James didn't do himself any favours, as he escaped by throwing the Great Seal of England contemptibly into the river. Parliament took a dim view of his actions and assumed that he had abdicated his right to rule. In 1689, while James was in France, Mary and William negotiated with Parliament, who established the English Bill of Rights, putting to rest at last the question about the inherent faith for the English people, for that of being Protestant. They then invited William and Mary to take the throne, with the proviso that they accept Parliament's supremacy. They did, and consequently became joint rulers of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Mary II, 1662 to 1694, William III's wife, was Queen Regnant of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, ruling in her own right as she was already part of the succession. William became William III of England and Northern Ireland and William II of Scotland. Affectionately known as King Billy in Northern Ireland, his heraldic colour orange came to represent the Irish Protestant struggle for religious tolerance, then, as now, in a country predominantly Roman Catholic. The new king reorganised England's state financial and administrative structures, centralising the power and wealth of the country in the hands of the Whig Junto, a self-appointed committee with political aims whose members constantly surrounded and supported him. He enabled them to assume positions of power, and they distributed the resources of the Crown in the forms of places, pensions and perquisites. In 1690, James landed back in Ireland to gather his forces and challenge William III for the throne. He was resoundingly defeated by that very seasoned campaigner at the Battle of the Boyne and fled again to France, never to return. Most popular histories refer to the period of their joint reign informally and quite affectionately as that of William and Mary, which can give a false impression of their marriage, which, although unhappy from her point of view at first, settled down to becoming quite successful once they both realised they enjoyed a mutual interest in art and architecture. William spent much of his reign abroad, embroiled in continental battles, and while he was away, Mary was from all accounts a very firm, effective and powerful ruler, although she wisely deferred to him when he was in town. Patronage of contemporary writers by Whig statesmen took place under William's authority. John Gascoigne's 1989 account of the evolution of the University of Cambridge at this time reveals there was a network of Whig sympathisers among the bishops and academics who used their position to shape the theological, political and cultural future, influencing students who were future leaders of their age. Following the Revolution, William and Mary sought to establish the authority of their new regime by investing in great building works. During their time, the Dutch-French influence on the arts would be profound and long-lasting. In their entourage was multi-talented French Huguenot designer Daniel Marot, William's Master of Works at Holland, responsible for the works at the Palace of Het Lauw in the Netherlands, which we have discussed previously. Mary was one of Europe's leading collectors of ceramics, and Daniel Marot developed this design for the display of her collection at Het Lauw. Marot was at the centre of a vast web of Huguenot artisan craftsmen, both in England and Holland, where he produced designs that range from snuff boxes to coaches and clocks, and from parterres to flower pots. In England, he would be the first architect since Inigo Jones to envisage an integrated style for interiors and exteriors. His creative genius lay in ability to conceive the design for the exterior, the interiors and the gardens as one vision, declaring that design unity was the only route to successful results. He was Louis XIV's dream team, all rolled into one. William and Mary wanted to create an up-to-date court out of the old palace at Hampton, which when it was first built, like most of the great houses of London, was approached by water. Today, however, the main entrance is through the Trophy Gate, which was built by William III, to be approached from the town by road. William III, 1689 to 1702, chose Hampton Court as his principal out-of-town residence because London's fog and smoke at that time was perilous and worsened his asthma. He commissioned Christopher Wren to replace the old place with a new one to rival Versailles, because William's greatest antagonist was Louis XIV. One of the main reasons for their enmity was that Louis had offered the hand of one of his mistress's daughters to William in marriage. However, William was insulted, rebuffing the offer, saying that his family only married legitimate daughters of kings, not their bastards. Louis, who loved and cherished all of his children, never forgave him. The English surveyor of works was still Charles II's appointee, Sir Christopher Wren, who spent much time at Hampton Court, where the shell of the new building was largely completed by mid-1693. It was built with a mixture of orange brick and Portland stone, which integrated well with the original Tudor brickwork. In the vestibule, French Huguenot wrought iron worker Jean Tijoux, fabulous balustrades, and Italian painter Antonio Verrio's frescoes embellish Wren's great staircase, which was completed about 1690 and is a highlight of the English Baroque style. At Hampton Court, Wren designed the Queen's private apartments as a series of intimate rooms so she could display her collection of blue and white wares, which included Dutch and English works, as well as Japanese porcelain, all of which copied original Chinese porcelain forms and painted decoration. 110 pieces of ceramics, many of which are Chinese blue and white wares from the late Ming or early Qing periods, about 1620 to 1683, still survive at Hampton Court. The rest are Dutch or English Delft. The origins of the blue and white tin glazed earthenwares from Delft lay in the ancient past of modern-day Iraq, where in the 6th century local ceramic workers produced tin-glazed earthenwares. This had been in a response to the arrival of Chinese porcelain on their shores. Their descendants, the Moors, conquered Spain in the 9th century, and the wares they produced there were given the name Mallorca, from the early name for Mallorca. From the 9th century, Moresque Spain exported wares to Italy, where once again local manufacturers produced their own version of Mallorca. Between 1519 and 1648, when the southern Netherlands was under Spanish rule, ceramic workers from Italy migrated to Dutch cities, particularly to the little town of Delft. And so it was that in this way, the traditions of a Mediterranean style of earthenware came to be made and appreciated in a northern European country. Dutch Delft from this era can be found with all sorts of delightful decorative quirks. Europeans at this time didn't have any idea about what someone from China might look like, or what the symbols painted on Chinese blue and white porcelains actually meant. So the workers divided the plate up into compartments copying the Chinese and painted tulips, what they thought were Chinese people, and other local motifs. They produced pieces of great charm. I have seen a plate with a game of noughts and crosses on the back instead of Chinese dynasty landmarks. This makes them highly collectible. The Huguenot immigrants Jasper Andries and Jacob Jansen brought their recipe for producing tin-glazed blue and white earthenwares to England in 1567. They established a pottery at Norwich, and factories established at London, Bristol and Liverpool later on, during the closing years of the 17th century and early 18th century, would also produce wonderful pieces of English Delft tin-glazed earthenwares. The 17th century passion for flowers meant that the tulips from Amsterdam were placed into Queen Mary's great collection of ceramic tulip vases, which she and her husband collected avidly. The origin of their shapes is the East, where they were popular as flower holders during the 12th century. In the 17th century, bulbs were planted within each tier, and the growing shoots emerged through the open sprouts. When they were in bloom, they were taken indoors for display. Elaborate examples of these vases had up to 11 tiers, some in the form of a Chinese pagoda. This splendid example, 1 metre high, was designed by Daniel Marrow. Only a visit to Hampton Court can reveal its true magnificence, the superb lid made in the shape of a royal crown. In the late 17th century, great estates were building their own fully equipped dairies, where the fresh milk would arrive daily. It was poured into blue and white ceramic milk pans to allow the cream to settle, which was then skimmed off and churned into butter. Managing a dairy for the best part of a century or more from Mary's reign onward would be viewed as a highly appropriate pastime for women, associated as it was with romantic notions of goodness and simplicity. And from the late 17th century onward, dairies and their containers were embellished with sumptuous decoration. At Hampton Court from 1689, a detached Tudor building fronting the Thames, known as the Old Water Gallery, was remodelled after designs by Daniel Marrow into a dairy with all conveniences, in which it's said the Queen took great delight. All the surviving milk pans, thought to have come from this dairy, bear the mark of Adrianus Cox, proprietor of the prestigious Greek factory at Delft in the Netherlands, which was in business from 1686 to 1701. At the time of her death, Mary II owed Mr. Cox £122 14 shillings and 9 pence for Dutch china or ware. William created his trusted friend Hans Willem Bentinck, who had maintained a garden boasting many botanical rarities in Holland, the Earl of Portland, He also gave him the authority to coordinate all the work on the royal gardens. Bentinck showed off his skill for diplomacy by selecting the Englishman George London to be his deputy, and he appointed other English staff to complete the works. William's interest lay in the waterworks, and so Wren arranged that all the principal rooms of the state apartments overlooked a fountain court and had an important vista. The smaller square windows at attic level were lodgings provided for important courtiers, and carved wreaths in the form of lion skins surround the circular windows. Queen Mary sent her emissaries to the Canary Islands and Virginia in the Americas to obtain new specimens for her collection of hothouse plants. She always had freshly cut flowers in her apartments, including the most highly prized flower of their reign, the centifolia rose. It appeared in wall paintings and in the carved decoration that Grinling Gibbons completed for the King's apartment. Daniel Marrow designed the great parterre at Hampton Court in 1689. Its size was predetermined by the semicircle of limes planned by Charles II, but only planted between 1689 and 90. The gardens were restored between 1991 to 1995. Over the centuries, many of the 304 yew trees and the 24 silver holly trees that had been planted had grown wild. In 1993, ring counting them proved that they were the original trees planted during the reign of William and Mary, and so they were very carefully and purposefully trimmed into the conical shapes they are today. No list survives of the original ornamental planting, so all the current colourful compartmental layouts were disposed in accord with what is known about planting systems during the first years of the 18th century. Much research was done into precisely the right clone for dwarf box, of which 30,000 plants were propagated to edge the parterres and the maze. Queen Mary's Bower, a tunnel of wych elm that ran along the western side of the Privy Garden, has also been reinstated using hornbeam. The original plants had survived until the 1970s, when they had been killed off by a devastating attack of elm disease that destroyed thousands of ancient and historical trees in Britain. Statues were copied from surviving originals, and Jean Tijoux' superbly wrought iron and gilded screens, which were designed to encompass all of the gardens, were superbly restored. The result is a restoration faithful to both the history and the character of the place. And now it's time for us to take a break until part 2 of England and its great treasure houses.